Well, there's people who live along Long Island Sound who will just straight up tell you that Lyme disease came from a place called Plum Island, kind of closer to Orient Point than it is to Connecticut, but everything's pretty close there. It is a place where some significant research has been done into animal diseases. And if you want to get super specific about it, and you go back far enough, there was an ex-Nazi scientist who had some relationship to the place and who appeared to be kind of interested in ticks. However, a lot of what we think about Plum Island or have heard about Plum Island really kind of is in the area of cryptozoology and X-Files paranoia. And then there's some real stuff that's worth talking about, too. We're going to do all of that today and also tell you how the place is likely to be preserved now. This is one of these shows, and I know I say this from time to time, this is one of these shows where we could easily do, this is a show about Plum Island, by the way, I shouldn't say that. Plum Island is an island off the coast of Connecticut and even more closely off the coast of New York's Long Island. And we could easily do two very chunky, not at all artificially padded shows about Plum Island, plus a third show on where Lyme disease originated. Because there are people listening to the show right now who think that Lyme disease originated in the government research lab on Plum Island and then came to Lyme, and Old Lyme and other places. I don't think that's true. I've done an awful lot of reading about this now. It doesn't really seem like that's probably true, but you could do a whole show about that and where else Lyme disease has been found and how old, and 60,000 years old maybe, and maybe present in the 5,300 years young Tyrolean man who was unfrozen. We could do a whole show about that. That's what I'm telling you. But we're not doing a show about that today. We're going to try to do a show about the totality of the story of Plum Island. It's a story that certainly dates back to a time when there were no Europeans here on this continent. It's a story that touches base with the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, with a fort founded around the turn of the century that was at least sort of active in World War I and World War II. It does include this mysterious and fairly top secret animal disease research facility. It includes an attempt by Donald Trump to buy it for a golf course, of course, what else, in 2013, but also Donald Trump signing a piece of legislation in December of 2020 that will probably have the effect of preserving Plum Island. Because the other thing that's amazing about Plum Island is because it's so restricted, so because access is so incredibly restricted, it has, as you're about to hear, this abundance of less troubled and more untrammeled wildlife and nature and ecosystems. It also, Fort Terry, the fort I was kind of alluding to before, is because it hasn't been vandalized or anything because nobody can get out to it. So it's kind of this amazing place. So, I'm just touching upon some of the ways in which this is a pretty interesting story. We have a lot of people here to help tell the story. I should also say it's like all over popular culture. You'll hear one of the most famous examples a little bit later, but there are, mystery novels by Nelson DeMille, and there's all kinds of stuff. There's a documentary, a paranoid documentary starring Jesse Ventura, in which he spends about half the time lamenting the fact that security precautions are inadequate on Plum Island, and the other half of the time lamenting the fact that when he tries to show up at Plum Island unannounced, he encounters massive amounts of pretty active, proactive security, which he doesn't like that. But he doesn't think there's enough security either. So go figure. All right. So I've prattled on long enough. Let's get the guest going here. We're going to start with Marian Lindberg, a conservation specialist for the Nature Conservancy and the author of Scandal on Plum Island. A commander becomes the accused. That's one I didn't even mention in my long summary. We're going to swing back to that eventually. But Marian Lindberg, first of all, welcome to the show. And let's talk a little bit about Plum Island. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me. And you did a Great summary. I know this is radio, but I would like to try to paint a picture as I see Plum Island.
Yes, please do. You are one of the fairly small group of people who are not involved in that kind of veterinary research, who has been there, who's walked around there, who's seen the sites. So tell us what it looks like.
Correct. Well, think of some of the most beautiful coastal views that the East Coast affords. Curved sandy beaches, boulders where seals haul out, bluffs and dunes, over 225 bird species, and the story of human and geological history going back thousands of years, told by the land itself, the water, and the vistas.
Now,
I'm going to keep going.
Oh, keep going. Yeah, keep painting.
Couple that with the opportunity, a really unique opportunity to address social injustices to America's First Peoples and members of the LGBTQ community, while preserving habitat that supports rare species. So that's my view of Plum Island.
And so that's kind of the plan now. We should say that the research facility, the semi-mysterious research facility, is going to be closed fairly soon. The plan is it's a biosafety lab level 3, which is not the highest level. It's been there since '54. I think there's reason to believe it's maybe not state of the art. So its functions are going to go out to a place called Manhattan, Kansas, which is ironic because the original flying monkeys from Wizard of Oz were developed on Plum Island. Okay, that's not true. That's a falsehood. So, but anyway, it's gonna be moved out to Kansas, and there was a plan to help finance this move to sell Plum Island to the highest bidder. Maybe you should pick up the story there and say what happened, why that didn't happen, and what's going to probably happen now.
Okay, correct. I would be happy to try to do that. Yeah, so this all started after 9/11. President Bush signed an order asking the Department of Homeland Security to look around for a place to put a higher level facility. As you said, Manhattan, Kansas was chosen. And around the time that the government was doing its administrative process to decide that, Congress very quietly, in one of the very large appropriations bills that they're famous for, instructed that Plum Island should be sold at auction. And this bypassed the normal federal procedures for disposing of surplus federal property. Those require the General Services Administration, which is the government's realtor, to offer the land to other federal agencies. And if they don't want it, then to offer it to state and local governments that have jurisdiction. And if they don't want it, then to offer it to nonprofits, and only then to sell it. But Congress quietly bypassed that. So I've been involved in a lot of land preservation deals, but this one has required overturning an act of Congress. And it took a lot of years, a lot of work by many people from a number of organizations in Connecticut, New York, and elsewhere, national organizations as well, and great help from Connecticut's elected officials. And finally, as part of the massive COVID stimulus bill, which had a lot of things in it, including copyright reform and many, many other aspects, there was a provision to undo the sale requirement of Plum Island. So that's where we are now. We have an opportunity to chart the future and not just fight this past mistake.
Right. So, and there's a drafted plan of what the island would look like if it could be basically used for conservation, preservation of natural habitats, some fairly restricted, educational visiting, and maybe some very limited guided tourist visiting. I mean, what does it take to get from where we are right at this moment to something like that, where we would be reassured that that's the way things were going to be going forward?
Well, we'll see. There are a lot of people working on it. There are a number of strategies. There's the Preserve Plum Island Coalition, which is a group that was put together around 2013, 2014, that has an Audubon, the Nature Conservancy, Save the Sound, Citizens Campaign for the Environment, the Coast Defense Study Group, which is a military history group, a number of organizations coming together to try to make this happen. And so there are a couple of different ideas. Of course, we think that a public owner would be the best equipped to manage it properly. So there aren't that many candidates for that, right? There's the federal government and the state government. It seems a little bit large for the local government. So it's a matter, it's going to take, two to do this dance. We can decide that we think the National Park Service is the best owner and manager, but if they aren't interested, if they have other pressing priorities, then it's not going to happen. So it's a matter of a dance that requires finding out who is most open to doing this and how do we make that happen. So we do have the support of the senators and representatives from Connecticut and New York. Senator Schumer was very helpful in the action that happened in December, and so we are working all of the levers that we can. So it's a long process because the lab is not really scheduled to close until 2023, and the buildings, the work of the labs has always been subject to what they call the autoclave process, which is a very extreme heat, which destroys any pathogens, but they will be doing additional contamination. Of course, the idea is not to have members of the public go into the buildings on the west side of the island. It's a small, very discrete part of the island, and the rest of the island, which has been zoned for conservation, very forward-thinking of the town of Southold. The rest of the island is mostly in its natural shape, except for the Fort Terry buildings, which there are about a dozen of the original buildings, the administrative heart in, not the greatest condition, but as you say, not, it's been natural deterioration. It hasn't really been vandalism, and some of them in better shape than others. And they provide the opportunity for some restoration, perhaps a small dorm for researchers who are clamoring to get onto the island to do some ecological research. There's a lot of ecological management that could happen. What we want to do is to try to get some of that ecological management in place sooner rather than later, because there are invasive species that are damaging some of the incredible communities, natural communities on Plum Island. So that's an effort now. But we have a lot of really good people who are working on this, and the support of the public will be so important. And I really hope we can get your listeners the opportunity to visit the island.
Right. But you listeners will not be touring Lab 257 or anything like that. And that, I'm glad you said that. I was going to ask about that. And I realize that's not your area of expertise necessarily. But clearly that whole area is going to have to be, decontaminated pretty extensively and probably cooled off.
Yes, the Lab 257 is pretty interesting building. It's one of it's the axis between the first and second type of federal use on the island. So Lab 257 was Building 257, and it was the torpedo storage or mine and torpedo storage facility for Fort Terry, because that's one of the things that they did at Fort Terry. They never were engaged in any kind of combat or defensive firing. It was built at a time of great fear about an attack by the Spanish Navy when the United States and Spain were engaged in the controversy over the Spanish treatment of Cubans. And so there was a alarm over the state of coastal defenses, and Fort Terry was one of a number of forts that was built, but it never saw any action. They practiced harbor mining because that had actually been done in Cuba, and so they built a building with very thick cement walls, far away from any of the barracks and other buildings on Plum Island, and that building still stands. And that is the building that, after Fort Terry was decommissioned after World War II, that was then converted into the first animal disease center, opened in 1954. And there's a pretty interesting New London Day article about when the reporters were shown the newly renovated lab in 1954. And a one-way chute for the animals was built at that time, added to the building. So that building is very far away from anything. It's easily cordoned off. And New York State officials have worked very hard with the federal government representatives and contractors to assess everything about Plum Island, both the interior and the exterior, and they're pretty satisfied with the plans for Building 257.
All right, so there's so much to cover here, but we would be remiss if we did not at least pause for a moment with your book, Scandal on Plum Island. Actually, I mentioned the Nelson DeMille book. I noticed that he blurbed your book as well. And so this is a historical account of a commander who in the 1910s, well, you should tell the story of what happened at Fort Terry.
All right. So this seaside post didn't have a lot of discipline in the early 1900s. As they say, there was no action. So they sent somebody who was pretty buttoned up to be the commander, Major Benjamin Keeler from Western Iowa, who had gone to West Point, fought in the Philippines in the Philippine War. And so he gets to Plum Island. He brings his sister because he's unmarried. So he brings his unmarried sister to live with him and help him entertain visitors. And he is, by all accounts, doing a great job until the end of 1913. He's brought to Governor's Island and he's told that a captain has leveled accusations against him that he, the major, groped both the captain and other male subordinates. And Major Keeler denied this, but he was court-martialed. And it was the beginning of federal policy against perceived homosexuality in the military.
Yeah, you could sort of argue that there's a dotted line anyway from there to don't ask, don't tell.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It got worse before it got better, but it took a long time. And it's a fascinating transcript. The court-martial was just full of bias and prejudice and innuendo. So as I'm a lawyer, I have worked on cases that illustrated the problems with the legal system, and this really played to that interest. And it also is just a fascinating social context because this was at the end of the 1800s, as you know, women were seeking the vote and they were actually succeeding in certain places. And they were in public life more than ever before. And there were some men that were not happy about this. One of them was Theodore Roosevelt, who played a very large role in pushing America toward war with the Spanish and the Rough Riders, one of the most enduring aspects of the Spanish-American War. And he was giving speeches about how American men had become too weak and too effeminate. And of course, what makes men strong? War. And he really was very ushering in this, very militarized and aggressive idea of manhood. And part of that was a pushback against all things feminine. This is when the Boy Scouts started in 1910. It's when bodybuilding and going to the gym and team sports and the resurrection of the cowboy as the American hero. And one of the fallouts of that was a real scrutiny of men's body types and the way they conducted themselves. Were they obviously sexually interested in women or not? And Major Keeler was really more interested in his gardening and reading and spending and having tea with his sister than a lot of the macho things at the fort. And so the book talks about how the attitudes of the time and the malice of some of the men at the fort combined to and the hysteria about people who didn't conform to the sexual mores of the day, all combined in a very unhappy way for him.
What was the ultimate disposition of Major Keeler's court-martial?
It was a very mixed verdict. It makes no logical sense, the verdict. He was cleared on some things and not on others, and he ultimately went back to Iowa and lived the life of a farmer.
Well, on that possibly bucolic, and now the lab is going to follow him out there to Kansas. All right, so on that note, we're going to take a little break here. When we come back, we're going to focus kind of specifically. We're going to add another guest, but Marian is going to stay with us, and we're going to focus kind of specifically on this research facility.
Tie back your hair and prep materials, the materials. 1, don't you taste a sniff, you know you should be wafting if you're taking a whiff. 2, don't mix it in until the label's checked again.
If your profile helps us catch Buffalo Bill in time to save Catherine Martin, the senator promises you a transfer to the VA hospital at Oneida Park, New York, with a view of the woods nearby. Maximum security still applies, of course. You'd have reasonable access to books. Best of all, though, 1 week of the year, you get to leave the hospital and go here. Plum Island. Every day of that week, you may walk on the beach, you may swim in the ocean for up to 1 hour under SWAT team surveillance, of course. And there you have it. This offer is non-negotiable and final. Catherine Martin dies, you get nothing.
Plum Island Animal Disease Research Center. Sounds charming.
Of course, that is former Connecticut Governor Ella Grasso talking to Mad Dog Taborski. We have the audio. No, it's not. That's not. It's from Silence of the Lambs. You know that. You know that already. But there's Plum Island right there. Plum Island does occur an awful lot in popular culture. It is speculated at one point that Cloverfield, or the monster that is in the movie Cloverfield, is from Plum Island. He is not. I knew him personally. He's not from Plum Island. Plum Island, no connection to that. But, I mean, you just can't have something like this. You can't have a research facility like this in a restricted location that's very close to population centers. The thing that it's the closest to is actually Point Orient in New York on Long Island. But you can't have something like that without people speculating about it all the time, worrying about it all the time, wondering what sort of things are coming wafting to, the Connecticut coastline on prevailing winds from the facility. And as I said at the top of the show, there's been rampant speculation that Lyme disease comes from there. Lyme disease has been around a really long time. Probably doesn't come from Plum Island. And all kinds of other mostly kind of crazy conspiracy stuff. But the reality is there is this facility there, and somewhat disturbingly, it's getting older and maybe isn't state of the art, isn't as secure as and up to date as it should be. That's why they're moving it out to Manhattan, Kansas. But here to tell us a little bit more about that is Geoff Manaugh, making, I believe, his third appearance on our show, spread out over 11 years. He's the co-author of Until Proven Safe, The History and Future of Quarantine. Marian Lindberg is still with us, conservation specialist for the Nature Conservancy, author of Scandal on Plum Island. So, Geoff, welcome back. It is your third appearance, I believe.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's great to be back. It's been a long time.
Yeah. So maybe just once again, I keep referencing, as does Dr. Lecter, the Plum Island Animal Disease Center, but maybe just quickly mention your understanding of what it is and why it's sitting out there in the middle of Long Island Sound.
Well, sure. Yeah. I mean, as you mentioned, and as the name itself implies, it's a place for high security animal disease research. It's deliberately on an island so that it can be, contained by the ocean waters itself, so that people don't accidentally drive a car into the facility or that kind of thing. So it's both natural security and actual security from potential attack, but it's meant to research diseases such as foot and mouth disease, which is highly contagious and can result in millions, if not even billions of dollars of damage to livestock herds. It spreads incredibly easily. So by keeping it contained on an island, the idea is that it's actually the safest place you could have it. Of course, as you just mentioned, it is getting older, and then also it's only a biosecurity level 3 lab, which means there are other diseases that it's not actually licensed to hold or to research, which is one of the reasons. There are many reasons, but it's one of the reasons why they're actually closing down Plum Island in the next couple of years and shifting all of that research into the very heart of livestock country out in Manhattan, Kansas.
Yes, and in your article, which you co-authored, well, actually, you've written two pieces, but your article for Wired that you co-authored with Nicola Twilley, you mentioned that there are some people who question the wisdom of this, that you are, first of all, putting something right in the middle of an area that's full of the kind of livestock that would have much to fear from diseases like hoof and mouth disease and related diseases. You're also putting it right in the heart of the tornado belt where things can go, crashing into other things. So talk a little bit about that. Like, Were you ultimately, you guys were out there, were you ultimately persuaded that we shouldn't lie awake at night worrying about this problem instead of the Plum Island problem?
Well, it's funny. I mean, you have to have a lot of faith in the engineering capacity of the architects and the construction firms who are behind the facility there in Manhattan. And I mean, I definitely did come away, and Nikki did as well. Convinced of their competence and the fact that they're doing a great job. They've done an unbelievable amount of tests, including having security teams come through to actually kind of game out where maybe a terrorist attack might try to strike the building. They've also looked at the tornado hardiness of the building itself. So theoretically, this thing is actually going to be able to withstand a Category 5 tornado. And it will be able to do that through not just the sheer mass of the building, but also because it's got a really, really interesting and complex air handling system. So that even when the pressure drops and a tornado hits, the inside of the building will be able to adjust to that, so that the labs that are under different kinds of air pressure can adjust on the fly and won't start venting animal diseases into the surrounding landscape. But it was pretty sobering. In 2010, there was actually a federal study that was commissioned to look at the possibility of release there. And they actually found that there was a 70%, that is a 70% chance of a escape of a virus or microbe or other pathogen from the laboratory. That was thankfully before the tornado hardening and before many other things happened to upgrade the design and make it more secure. And now, at least theoretically, that 70% risk of escape is now a 0.1% risk of escape. But it is actually, imagining these kinds of diseases, if you think Plum Island is close to population centers, this is even closer in the sense that it's close to a population, maybe not a human population, because it's the heart of agricultural Kansas, but it's the heart of cattle country. So this is the one place you would think that you wouldn't necessarily want to be looking at diseases like foot and mouth. But at the same time, it just goes to show how extreme our engineering capabilities are, and also just how committed the teams are to ensuring its safety.
Marian, maybe you can just sort of give us a sense. My sense, I don't spend a lot of time along the Connecticut coastline, and I don't spend any time on Long Island, but when I'm there, I feel like I don't have to go very far. I could sit in the bar at the Saybrook Point Inn for a couple of hours on a busy night and pretty easily find some people who'd want to talk about Plum Island or think that they got Lyme disease because of Plum Island, or tell me that when they see people getting off the ferry, workers getting off the ferry at Old Saybrook, that they have these strange expressions on their faces and they don't talk to one another. Of course, I think they've actually taken 3 showers in order to get off the island. That might have taken a little bit of the vivacity out of them. But I don't know. My sense is there's kind of a low murmur in the vicinity of Plum Island of kind of worry, or maybe just people who thrill in trafficking and X-Files stuff.
I think that's true. I was at my little post office mailing copies of my book, and I happened to speak to somebody, and 2 strangers said, "Oh, that's the Lyme disease place." So that's my anecdote. But at the same time, under the last director, the lab made a point of having visits and opening the island up, because as the authors of the wonderful history book about Plum Island from the North Fork say, it seems as though the less people knew about Plum Island, the more they invented. And so the operations director had a lot of nonprofits and schools come to visit. And and you got to remember, 400 people were coming from Connecticut and New York every day to work there. They're the biggest fans of protecting the island, because they know the biodiversity and the birds, and have been really interested in seeing a conservation outcome. But this Lyme disease theory is really it is ubiquitous. You're absolutely right that the oldest human, I've done the research too. The oldest human with Lyme disease was supposedly found in the Alps, 5,300-year-old corpse, and that the bacteria itself has been found in 12 million years old. But this rumor did get a lot of play, and the most of the theories about Plum Island, they're not well documented. They're not. You just don't see footnotes. You don't see, you just don't see the kind of references that would give them credibility.
I mean, we do know that, and you sort of already, I think, kind of referenced it, Geoff. I mean, that there are, I think in the article you say close calls. I mean, there was in 78, for example, the hoof and mouth disease kind of wasn't maybe as ideally contained as it could have been. I mean, I imagine if you're going to have a facility like this, you're going to have what are ideally close calls as opposed to disasters.
I mean, you certainly will. I think that, to echo Marian's point, I think that it's easy to go too far and start inventing conspiracy theories that are more like a Stephen King novel as opposed to something that actually is going to happen or has happened. But these kinds of facilities, these kinds of high risk infrastructural sites, I think do just inspire fear. People get a feeling, if there's a nuclear power plant, in one county over, or if there's an animal disease research center, or we saw it when Ebola, during the outbreak, when nurses and doctors were returning to the United States who had potentially been exposed to it. The fear was that Ebola would break out and become endemic in Dallas or Boston or wherever it might be. But I think giving into that kind of fear is a mistake. It's definitely interesting if you're a screenwriter or a novelist or that kind of thing. But I think that those kinds of close calls are just sort of par for the course to a certain extent for some of these things. Someone just accidentally does something very minor, and thankfully, we've had a really good safety record for these kinds of things. But yes, to your point, also there was an interesting thing in 2002 when the organizers, federal organizers, put together a role-playing simulation about what would happen if foot and mouth did escape, and what would it take to mop it up and to clean things up. And the consequences are quite bad. It's a low-risk, high-consequence event. And in this particular case of this simulation in 2002. The National Guard was actually called up within the simulation, and they had to start putting down farm animals throughout the region. And it actually got so bad that the National Guard ran out of bullets in this simulation. So, I just think that that's the kind of thing. If you're dealing with something that, if the consequences of it are high, even if there's very little risk that it will happen, you definitely need to plan for it, and it can keep you up at night. But it's the kind of thing that shouldn't become the origin of conspiracy theories.
So, I've seen HUD, so I know all about hoof and mouth disease. But I think there's sort of three different strands that kind of get wrapped up here, Geoff. One of them is the notion, we're kind of talking about it right now. I mean, hoof and mouth is a pretty apolitical disease. It's not, I don't think, known to have ever been weaponized or anything like that. So you've just got diseases kind of like the one we just went through that you are still going through, that you just, you don't want them to spread. You don't want them to get out and wipe out huge amounts of our food supply or whatever. That's one. Then there's this kind of notion that maybe somebody would intentionally introduce diseases like this. And I've seen some reported saying that there were Al-Qaeda people who had documentation that indicated that they were aware of, for example, Plum Island. But you want to be able to fight it off if it's ever used as a bioweapon. And then there's sort of rumors, and they date back even really before 54 to this guy, Erich Traub, who'd been a Nazi scientist who was recruited so that the Russians wouldn't get him, who at least set foot on Plum Island a few times. There are prevailing notions that somehow or other, either here or maybe to come in Kansas, we're developing our own bioweapons. I don't know. Can you pull that lanyard apart a little bit? I mean, just in terms of the relevance of each one of those three threads?
Well, sure. I mean, the possibility of these things being weaponized, I think, is a real fear. Actually, one of the things that was quite interesting about researching the new facility in Manhattan is that the president of that university is a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff named Richard Myers, General Richard Myers, and he had actually been involved when I think it was a SEAL team in Afghanistan actually found that list, the Al-Qaeda list of plant and animal pathogens that were clearly indicating that Al-Qaeda was interested in pursuing these kinds of things. They were looking at anthrax, they were looking at rice blast, stem rust, which is a disease of wheat, with the idea being that the presumed idea being that they would actually be targeting the global food supply. What better way to sort of bring the world to its knees than to get rid of its ability to eat? And so that kind of realization that, our adversaries might be targeting these soft targets it was part of what inspired General Myers when he then ended up at Kansas State University to really kind of help push for the already existing desire there to open up a BSL 4 level facility that we're now, is going to be the next Plum Island. But yeah, so it's a real fear. I mean, our enemies might do it, and it would have catastrophic consequences if that were to be the case. Of course, it's actually quite easy to spread some of these diseases, which is the unfortunate aspect of it all. And then in terms of our own capacity, I mean, I'm definitely not an expert in biological weaponry in terms of the United States military, but I do know that we are contractually or treaty bound, not to develop these kinds of things. If in further conspiracy thinking, that kind of thing, is going on, I feel like I would just leave that to the novelists and the screenwriters. But yeah, I mean, these things are very risky, and you don't really you would only want to work with them very carefully, which is why we have such tightly engineered and very secure facilities for it.
So I think it should be mentioned.
Sure.
Could I just jump in?
Yeah,
and say
Marian,
that one
please
of
do.
the big aspects of the work at the Plum Island lab was to develop a vaccine for animals against the ability of foot and mouth to spread.
That's right.
Yeah. So, Marian mentioned, I think, the one-way shoot for animals that was shown to reporters in 54. This whole question of the disposition of animal carcasses in a place where you're messing about with pathogens like this is obviously a pretty big one. Geoff, what did you find out about what they're going to do in Kansas with animal carcasses and whether it's substantially different from what they've done on Plum Island?
Well, yeah, carcass disposal was a unexpectedly fascinating and morbid topic. To be honest, it was quite interesting to learn the difference even just between two different facilities that exist there in Manhattan. There's the Biosecurity Research Institute that already exists, and then right next door is the place that they're building now, which will be the Plum Island replacement. But so some of the anecdotes, at least that we learned, were pretty incredible. In the existing the BRI, the Biosecurity Research Institute. They actually put the corpses of these potentially or actually infected animals into these giant tissue digesters and basically reduce them down to what are called bone shadows. It's a kind of alkaline soup of what used to be an animal body. The bones themselves can be, are turned into a kind of crystalline shadow of themselves. And then the liquid is actually stored until they can get rid of it through the municipal sewage system. So they actually call the local sewage plant and say, "Hey, are you ready to take this? Is this a good time to get rid of our animal carcass waste?" And then they just put it into the sewer system, in the middle of the night. I should emphasize that it's sterile. It's not it's not infected animal parts or anything being sent through the sewers. But nevertheless, is a very evocative image to imagine this kind of liquid animal waste being sent out through the city sewers at midnight while the town is sleeping. But NBAF, the new place next door, is actually, upping the bar for how they get rid of animal bodies. And so there's everything from extreme sterilization. There's even partial incineration. There's a lot of things that are really quite good. There's nothing really to, there's no reason to be scared of how they are getting rid of the corpses. There are redundancies on top of redundancies.
All right. Apologies to anybody who had like a big lunch right before they started listening to the show. Do we know? I'll ask you. Marian may also know, but I'll start with you, Geoff. Do we know anything about what Plum Island did or does with animal carcasses?
Alas, I would probably kick that to Marian. Unfortunately, we did not look into the specifics of animal corpse disposal on Plum Island.
I'm not sure that we made sure that anybody did know. But Marian, do you know anything about this?
I know that there haven't been animals there for a while.
Yeah.
That they actually had an issue with some of their sewage disposal, and they've recently built a new treatment plant. So there haven't been animals there for a while. And prior to that, it's not something that I brushed up on for this interview. Sorry.
No worries. I just that it does sort of bleed, so to speak, into our final segment here, which I will introduce in a little while. But Marian, I guess one of the things that I'm sort of wondering about, and just listening to Geoff talk, thinking about even more, is imagine that, all of the conservation dreams come true, and we have this beautiful and basically pristine nature preserve and historical touring opportunity in terms of Fort Terry and stuff like that, and the preservation of habitat and some kind of thing where boats can come out and, guided tours can take place and stuff like that. Would it make sense? I mean, we already agreed they're not going to go on tours of Building 257, but would it make some sense to, with the visitor center or something? I would imagine there would have to be some kind of commemoration of and some kind of. I mean, we're not just going to brush this under the rug, right? We're going to
correct. I mean, and not only that, but going back in time, there's a lot of excitement about cultural restoration as well as the biological restoration in terms of anthropological, archaeological research, and better documentation of the early use by Algonquin peoples, staging across sound trading trips and fishing, and perhaps some way to there's a center in New York for Native peoples and the environment, and they talk about biocultural restoration. You heal the wounds to the land and preserve habitat while you also try to heal some of the wounds to the people. And there's that injustice, and then there's also the possibility of education and memorial to the injustices to many members of the LGBTQ community in the military. So there's a lot of potential for education, for healing, and the Animal Disease Center is just one other way in which humans dealt with, modern life and fear, and fairly successfully. And yes, you can't. It's part of the history of Plum Island. So how you deal with that, how you document that, it's another opportunity for education and understanding. I mean, I've learned so much researching Plum Island and also listening to Geoff and everything that's going on at the NBAF. I guess I know now why it's taken so long, because they all thought the island was going to be sold in 2014 or 2015.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're going to have to stop there. We've been talking to Geoff Manaugh, co-author with Nicola Twilley of Until Proven Safe, The History and Future of Quarantine, a very timely publication. Marian Lindberg is a conservation specialist for Nature Conservancy and the author of Scandal on Plum Island, A Commander Becomes the Accused. In our final segment, I don't know, we're going to maybe jump off the public radio side of the pool and really talk about one possible thing that happens to animal carcasses is they become cryptozoological monsters and wash up on beaches. There, I've said it.
What's that from? It's from weird diseases. I get weird diseases.
All right, get ready. Oh, I didn't know I was supposed to do a Robert Stack voice. I would have practiced. Nobody warned me. All right, so we are going to, first of all, before we do all this, I want to thank Kat Pastor. She's the person in the control room playing all these clips and keeping the show running properly. She's our technical producer. This episode is produced by Jonathan McPence. And I was, I think I could do Robert Stack, but I need more warning. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about the latest, the final leg of our journey. Ends on a sandy beach on Long Island where something washed up quite a few years ago. It became known as the Montauk Monster. Here to talk about this is Ellen Killoran, who wrote a piece she wrote a piece in 2018 called 10 Years Later, the Montauk Monster is Still a Weird, Gross, Dark Mystery. I would imagine that the intervening years have done nothing to dissipate that sense. Ellen Killoran is a staff reporter and editor at Crime Online. Welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me. Hello.
Hi. So tell us just really quickly about said Montauk Monster. What did it? What was it? What is it? What did it look like?
It looked like nothing that most of us had ever seen before. It looked like a monstrous creature. It washed up in July of 2008. So this is 13 years ago. And it became known to the rest of us by way of a Gawker story that published the photo of it. Very few people that I'm aware of actually saw this thing, if it did even exist. All of the discussion around it and the analysis of it was based on photographs. So the strongest theory there's so many theories, but the strongest one, and when I say strongest, I mean the one that seems to be the most agreed upon, is that it was a raccoon.
Right. I mean, it didn't look much like a raccoon in the photos that we've seen. Yeah, and I think the other thing that really characterizes this, as so often characterizes anything that kind of blurs into cryptozoology and conspiracy theories and all kinds of stuff, is that it's nobody knows where it went, right? I mean, it was lying dead on the beach, but I mean, pretty quickly the chain of custody collapsed.
That's a very good way of putting it. It absolutely disappeared. There was about 2 weeks between when this photograph was purportedly taken and when New York City media got a hold of it. So there was, as I said in my Observer piece about it, there was time to hide the body, and it sure was hidden. Anyone who even was willing to admit that they had seen it or knew anything about it all had stories about how it had been buried in someone's yard, but then stolen from there. No one was willing to tell a cohesive story about where it was. So, like I said, very few people have seen this creature, if in fact it was a creature, and no one who knows what happened to it is willing to talk about it.
And by the way, for people who make the mistake of watching the Jesse Ventura quote-unquote documentary episode about all this stuff, there's stuff about that and allegations that there was another one after that, and then there was a mutant dead person who washed up on the beach after that. So, I mean, you can have your paranoia inflamed as much as you want. But, I mean, there was a pretty persistent belief that whatever this thing was, it could have come from Plum Island. Just give us a sort of sense of what you heard about that.
Absolutely. That was probably the second most popular theory, was that it was some sort of an escaped mutant from Plum Island. And I think one of the reasons that theory was popular is because it did look like a mutant. It did not look like a raccoon at all. Not to me. So that was definitely one of the most pervasive theories. I did speak to some people about that when I reported the story, including one reporter who had been there. And he had only been to the level 1 part of it, but he still had to go through a government approval process to get there. And he believes that the security was so tight that nothing could have possibly escaped, certainly not an animal. But like you guys were discussing earlier, we don't know how the carcasses were disposed at that facility. So it's still a rumor that's flying around for sure.
So, one of the reasons I think that Steven Spielberg's movies are so popular is because they are like life. So if he were making this movie, the carcass would have been discovered by 3 girls, which it was, and then the town would have gotten really paranoid and refused to talk to reporters about it, which is also what happened, right? Reporting on this is really hard because there's like this Long Island-y beach community thing, nothing to see here. That's basically what you encountered, right?
Absolutely. And remember, of course, I didn't try and report on this until 10 years after the fact.
Right.
But I will say this, I do a lot of difficult reporting, and this was definitely one of the most memorable in terms of getting sources to agree to talk. But going back to 2008, that was a time that Montauk had really started to become on the radar of the scene, so-called, and where it became something that city people tried to kind of claim as their own, which, of course, when this happens, is the source of frustration for people who have lived there and enjoyed the peace of living there for, their whole lives before it became immensely popular with people who don't know much about it. So one of the really interesting things to me about this story is considering the possibility that it was all made up.
Yes.
I like to think about...
You want to get people off the beach? Tell them there's a monster flying around there. All right, we're going to have to stop, Ellen Killoran. I could talk to you about this for quite a bit longer. I'm sure you can get to the bottom of the Montauk Monster. And thanks for listening to the show about Plum Island. We're already getting somebody complaining that we weren't paranoid enough. I'm sorry about that.
If you're brave and strong, you'll last the trip. But if you're weak, you'll scream and run away. Join us on the trip to Monster Island, where the beasts of terror hunt you down. If you're brave and strong, you'll last the trip. But If you're slow, you'll probably be never found.